to respond to the Prime Minister's statement, and I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and to congratulate the government on much of what they have done during their first term. I say much, but not all, Mr Speaker. However, amongst the achievements have been the reform of the Resource Management Act, which the ACT Party has participated in, the rationalisation and the streamlining of various government departments, and I should also say, Mr Speaker, the passing of ACT's three-strike law, which has already started to make New Zealand citizens safer in their homes and their streets. And, sir, I say it's ACT's three strikes law because no one can deny that that law would not be on our statutes books but for the promotion of that by the ACT Party. And the Prime Minister, sir, freely acknowledges that the three strikes law would not have been passed without the ACT Party nudging and cajoling the National Party every step of the way. So the ACT and National Parties have also implemented and then expanded the 90-day trial period for employment contracts. This has helped to align our employment practices with those of the rest of the developed world, but more importantly, sir, it has given employers the opportunity to take on new employees and the confidence to know that if they're making a mistake, they are able to find an alternative. And so it's important to give confidence to employers so that new employees can be taken into the workforce. And so the ACT Party once again was instrumental in getting that policy extended to cover not just employers of less than 20 employees, but all employers in New Zealand, to give those employers the opportunity, sir, to improve the productivity and the employment of New Zealanders, sir. And, sir, while unemployment, sir, at 6.5% is higher than Australia, we can take some comfort from the fact that it is not around the levels of the United States and the United Kingdom of around 9 and 10%. And we're told informally, if we include those people actually looking to work full-time in the United States, probably closer to 15. But, sir, the fact that our unemployment rate is actually higher than Australia should be a concern to us. And already we've seen in the last week the New Zealand Herald reporting that net outwards immigration to Australia is already back on the increase. And so we need to be focusing continually on our relationship with Australia because, sir, unless we actually move to reduce the income gap between New Zealanders and Australians, we're going to see ever greater numbers of New Zealanders move overseas and move overseas permanently. And, sir, it is a fact that for generations, young New Zealanders have travelled overseas to gain experience, to gain job experience and to seek out new endeavours and new experiences, sir. But traditionally they've always returned to New Zealand. But increasingly, sir, they are not. And that should be a concern to all New Zealanders as more and more of our children and grandchildren grow up in countries other than New Zealand. Sir, it was this concern for the declining living standards of New Zealanders versus Australia that caused the ACT Party to campaign on reducing that gap, and we made it a fundamental plank of our 2008 election campaign. And in fact, we put out a 20-point plan to reduce that gap. And as part of our confidence and supply agreement with the National Party, we got the National Party to commit to the concrete goal, sir, of reducing that gap, eliminating that gap, and bringing our living standards alongside those of Australia by 2025. The ACT Party once again was instrumental in nudging the National Party, convincing the National Party to appoint the 2025 task force chaired by Don Brash. But, sir, it is a big challenge, as the task force pointed out in its most recent report last November, that if we continue on as we do now, we face the risk that a further 400,000 New Zealanders, a net 400,000 New Zealanders, will leave our shores, sir, for Australia by 2025. And, sir, interesting then, sir, that we have in this morning's Herald, New Zealand's Morning's Herald, the editorial headed up, National Needs New Policy on Closing the Gap. And the Herald reminds us that from the convenience of opposition, the National Party was able to make promises, was able to criticise the then Labour government on its position on the economy, but it points out that the challenge to raise our living standards is still there. And it says the government knew and certainly knows now that the comparative success against Australia would require bold and disruptive interventions. The Herald says the National Party, in making that commitment, in standing up, making that commitment for a concrete goal of lifting our living standards to Australia, would require bold policies and courage, sir. And the ACT Party has always led the way in promoting policies to align New Zealand's living standards, to raise New Zealand's living standards to that of our closest neighbour. And it concludes its editorial by saying, for its own sake, New Zealand needs bold economic initiatives which will position this country for sustained growth. And let me repeat that, sir. Let me repeat to the members in the House from the National Party tonight, for its own sake, New Zealand needs bold economic initiatives that will position the country for sustained growth. And sir, it is the role of the ACT Party to advocate those bold initiatives and to promote those policies, sir. And when I first rose this evening, Mr Speaker, I congratulated the National Party on much of what it's done. Tragically, sir, there are some things the National Party have done that have not been helpful for the economy, that have not moved the country in the direction of reducing that gap, sir. And I think of youth rates. I think of the National MPs voting against Sir Roger Douglas's private members' bill to reinstitute youth rates. And let me just remind members for a brief minute of that debate. We saw the former Labor government legislate to abolish youth rates, legislate to require employers to pay 16 and 17-year-old young people the minimum wage. And so what is the natural reaction of an employer when faced with employing someone who's, say, 30, has life experience, has jobs, has skill experience, or employing a 16 or 17-year-old, sir? And it is a lay-down misere. It is obvious, sir. Anyone who has spoken to employers knows that an employer will go for the most experienced person. Young people are being denied the chance to get on the bottom rung of the ladder. We are denying, this Parliament has denied young people, young 16 and 17-year-olds, to go out and get a job at $11 an hour, $10 an hour, $9 an hour, whatever the value, the economic value, sir, to their employer. And we've said we're going to throw you on the scrap heap and we're going to give you the unemployment benefit, what, $4.50 an hour, sir? And so how does that help raise New Zealand's productive capacity? How does it raise our prosperity? And sir, we've seen that with a significant increase in the youth unemployment since the Labor government first passed that legislation abolishing youth rates. So we've also seen a very significant cost to the economy in the emissions trading scheme. This was a scheme introduced by the Labor government. It came into effect on the 1st of January 2008, and it operates, sir, as a massive subsidy to foresters, a massive subsidy to foresters. And essentially what the Labor government put in place was this massive grant, a grant that essentially gives tree planters a one-off gain of about 230 tonnes of carbon. Mr Chevelle knows that's about $5,000 a hectare. And what the Labor government did is put in place a grant system that requires New Zealanders to pay some $500 million a year more in electricity and petrol to subsidise those massive subsidies. And sir, it's nothing annoys me more, nothing makes me laugh more than to hear Mr Goff stand up and talk about the price of electricity going up, the price of petrol going up, sir. Because Mr Goff knows full well that the emissions trading scheme under the Labor government would have resulted in not a 5% increase in electricity, but a 10%. A 10% increase in the price of electricity, sir. We can be thankful that the scheme was modified by National, but it shouldn't be there in the first place. It shouldn't be there in the first place, not operating as a $500 million a year subsidy to foresters. And Mr Chevelle thinks that's funny. He thinks that's funny, sir. But what your government, your government, Mr Chevelle, did was put in place a system that was going to require the National Party, if it carried on with it, to pay massive subsidies to foresters. Massive subsidies to foresters, and anyone in the industry who is smart, sir, knows that, and all New Zealanders are paying for it. They're paying for it with their electricity and their petrol, and if there's anything that's contributing to that gap, sir, the gap between New Zealand and Australia, it's the emissions trading scheme. Thank you, Mr Speaker.